We have a panel called Crafting Necessary Spaces to explore rhetoric, Black history, and cultural transformation. Mostly, I'm just going to introduce, and our panelists are going to lead us and present us some projects and lead us in discussion. We have, in order from their sitting, Victoria Gallagher. She is a professor of communication at North Carolina State University. Sitting next to her is Keon, who is an assistant professor of graphic and industrial design, also at North Carolina State University. And next to him is Keon Pettiway, who is an assistant professor of communication at Eastern Michigan University. Unfortunately, Kim Gallen from Purdue University was not able to join us today. However, she has sent her co-panelists some questions and some thoughts that I think they're going to be integrating in. So without further ado, please welcome our panelists.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
To everybody out there. So over the course of the past couple of days, there's been this train of thought that's been running. I think the two projects that we'll see today by our colleagues actually kind of gesture toward, at least open up some questions for us to think about. And that is, if in fact we talk about doing digital humanities intentionally and intentionally Black, then what does it mean to do Black digital humanities? And something that Andre Brock said this morning I think is very vital here, and that is, how do we transition from a mode of doing to rather understanding what are people's relationship with technology, right, in producing DH projects. So is it an act of doing, or is it really an act of reframing and framing and reframing again, what are people's relationship to technologies, right, and what does it mean to start off from a position of Blackness to critique but also develop digital humanities projects? So just to give you a brief overview of the structure of the presentation, I'll provide a brief overview of some recent discussions and 5 common themes that Kim Gallen notes about technology recovery. And then afterwards, we will hear from Derek Ham, who is going to talk about the I Am a Man project, and Victoria Gallagher will talk about the Virtual MLK project. And we will end with questions about what it means for doing a technology of recovery. And that'll be followed by actually some critiques that Kim Gallen has provided for us about both projects. A few questions to keep in mind, and we'll return to these at the end, but at the juncture of Black digital humanities, rhetoric, and design, we should consider the following. How does the use of digital technologies to recreate or create a new experience of Black history or public address change or shape our knowledge about it? To what extent can augmented or online gaming and VR simulations capture the uniqueness, the immediacy, and the interactivity of Black history and public address? What can we learn from these projects about the role of practices of commemoration and or public address in social and civic transformation? What can we learn from these projects about using humanities and design scholarship with digital technology to engage and build communities? And then lastly, what do these projects tell us about models of digital humanities leadership for doing what Kim Gallen calls a technology of recovery? So let's talk about some intersections. Recent discussions before our conference today has ensued. Now, in the spirit of citations, if you will, I just note just a few of them that has preceded our current moment. 2008 E-Black Studies Manifesto, which was a result of discussions and workshops during conferences of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and the National Council of Black Studies. In 2012, there was the Race and Digital Humanities conversation on Left of Black. And then in 2016, there were a number of things happening, right? There was Exploring the Humanity in the Digital Humanities at Purdue University. Kim Gallen wrote Making a Case for the Black Digital Humanities and Debates in the Digital Humanities. And then at University of Maryland, there was the Synergies Among Digital Humanities and African American History and Culture, an integrated research and teaching training model. And then most recently in 2017, there was the special issue in Black Scholar, Black Code, by guest editors Jessica Marie Johnson and Mark Anthony Neal. Sans what's been happening now with academic discourse, museum spaces have also been engaging in VR technology. At the International Museum for Civil and Human Rights, they recently had a VR experience of King's Speech Drum Major. This was about maybe a few months ago. Over in Cincinnati, there is also a VR experience of, this is of the Montgomery bus boycott, right? There's also a VR experience at a number of other institutions and museum spaces that lend toward this idea of what does it mean to actually engage in immersive experiences using technologies like VR. So in Technology of Recovery, which guides our project, Kim Gallen pretty much lays out 5 common themes that might make up a Black digital humanities. And she poses these 2 questions to help us think about these themes. What then do Black digital humanities mean for humanities in its relationship to digital tools? And ultimately, the task of digital humanities is to ask this central question. What aspect of the digital humanities might be made more humanistic if we were to look at them from the perspective of Blackness? Her 5 common themes are as follows. Recovering lost historical and literary texts is central. However, she takes it a step further. Technology recovery is about seeking to restore the humanity of Black people lost and stolen through systemic global racialization. Any historical digital recovery project also should include a search and have a mission for what she calls the collective recuperation of a lost peoplehood. Digital recovery projects should be led by or heavily involve Black scholars in ways that expand what we understand the digital humanities to be and its potential for critically thinking about power. And recovery projects probe and disrupt the ontological notions that would have us accept humanity as some fixed category. And lastly, Black Digital Humanities Project conceptualizes a relationship between Blackness and the digital, where Black people's humanity is not a given, such as revealing how methodological approaches come to bear on and transform the digital processes and tools used to study humanity. So in the next projects coming forward, these address some of the 5 common themes that Kim Gallen asserts in the technology of recovery, and we hope to engage you in some of these questions afterwards. Thank you.
So just piggyback off of what Keon said, when we look at some of these projects as instances, one of the things that's important for us to understand is that when it comes to virtual reality, we don't have all the rules made yet. It's not like it comes from a long history of common use. Although VR has been used for several years, what we call this mainstream revolution of the Oculus Rift, HTC Vive, and so on devices, we're all making up the rules, not only in academia, but even in industry. So a lot of these projects are examples of experimentation, working in collaborations, working in teams, and I would say even a little bit of luck, ending at the right place at the right time. So I would offer us to start to look at Bloom's taxonomy and thinking about how VR might be a conduit for us to go through these different levels of understanding. And when you think about this as a tool, right, as a tool for us to receive knowledge in a deep way, there's something about the immersive nature that puts you in the context of situations in which we have never seen a digital medium do this before, right? So I always use the example of when you look at something on a TV screen, you're always conscious of the boundaries, the edges. So you can always in your mind separate yourself from the context. I'm here, that's there, you may connect with the characters, the story, the space, the information, but there's always this barrier there. So now when we talk about a piece of technology that tracks the user, that tracks the hands, to really immerse you in that space, we can potentially pass through these different levels from knowledge to comprehension, application analysis, all the way to evaluation in a meaningful way, in a way that we've never seen before. And you'll see that in some of the examples of the I'm a Man project. For me, it starts with thinking about positioning the actual user who receives the information. I was fortunate enough that this technology has come along right at the time when I was looking at some of these things. And with virtual reality, the first iteration, yes, I was in the space, and it was magical. You could look around, you felt you were there. But there's something powerful about transforming the user, whether you're transforming their gender, their ethnicity, or whatever you can do that's visible from the outside that makes the person pause to say, well, who am I in this story? And before the use of this type of avatar base, yes, we've seen that kind of third party where you've had to look at a screen, you control an avatar, and you rely on the individual to connect with that little person on the screen trying to connect. With VR, with these touch controllers, you have no choice. You cannot separate yourself before the story. When you look down, your hands are black in I Am a Man. So there's no escaping the ethnicity that's being placed on you, and then of course throwing you into the situation of 1968 and the Civil Rights Movement that only escalates what's going on. For me as a professor in graphic design, one of the things that I try to do is bring this work with my students in a meaningful way. And a lot of the things that we're asking now in design and design research is how do we collaborate with different entities. And so with this project, I was able to work with the National Civil Rights Museum. And beyond creating the VR project, was able to coordinate for our students to prototype what does it look like for VR to operate in a public space. Once again, as I said before, as we make up VR, making up these rules, there's something uniquely different between someone in their privacy of their own home, with a little headset on, doing whatever, than putting out in a public space. Institutions that have been along for several years. We know how to do museums. We know how to do libraries. In the next project, you'll see how VR is placed in a library. So by situating in the museum, there's several unanswered questions about understanding the flow of traffic, understanding what people feel emotionally, understanding that VR is not itself the full thing, that there's something called pre-activities, in-activities, and post-activities. What do people do before they put the headset on? What do people do when they come out of the headset? So now we're talking about very intent programming, thinking about all the different emotional levels one might go through with a medium of this nature. So one of the things that we do in a design discipline is we go through iterations. In this case, very practically speaking, I had 30 students. They were separated in 8 teams. They worked on models. What was interesting is that the students themselves had to deal with the history and their own biases. This was a course in which, out of the 30 students, I only had 2 African American students that connected with it in a very personal way. Not to suggest that if you aren't black, you couldn't connect to the stories, but in polling and talking to the students, this was new for them. They had never really heard about I Am a Man. They knew Dr. King, they knew the assassination, some of them even knew about Memphis, but the whole reason why he was there. So this became transformative even for me as an instructor, dealing with students to deal with this part of history, letting them deal with their own understanding and biases, to then think about the population that the project serves, and then wrap together in several bits of proposals. And in working with the museum, and you saw the slide before that Skyped in with them, they called them out on stuff. They said, you know what, that solution there, you're not there yet. You need to dig deeper. So we had to keep pushing on them. So I think there's something transformative here about giving students something that they have to wrestle with, and not, this is very, very common, I guess, with a class where they all come from that same background, but making them struggle and cross over that divide to learn to design for it. So I want to share briefly some of the actual product that was produced in this VR piece. I was able to do the first public demo at the MLK 50th celebration in Memphis, Tennessee. It was a beautiful day. It was a very emotional day, just to see all the speakers out there talking. If anyone's ever been to the Civil Rights Museum, you know the balcony is preserved there. You see where King stood. Across the street, they actually have preserved where the shooter presumably, of course, took the shot. But all these things are there preserved. So it was interesting for us to say, okay, this is history. We have it there. But now we're producing this virtual experience that lets you do something more in it. So while we were there at MLK 50, we were able to demo. And this is just a little bit of a trailer to show you what that experience looks like in a headset.
And treat them as though they are not men. That just in terms of whether or not a union can organize, it's still racism. For at the heart of racism is the idea that a man is not a man, a person is not a person. And so the racism has been obvious, it seems to me, from the very beginning of this whole matter.
Who also seems to be the spokesman for the union and a former sanitation employee worker, he said he had no comment at this time.
The Lorraine Motel, Dr. King was shot as he stood on the second floor balcony outside of his room. Police have established the bullet came from the top floor of the boarding house.
So, let's skip to the next. So, people connect with this from their different point of view. Obviously, people from Memphis felt that natural connection with it because they feel ownership, like this is their story. So even in the branding objects that put there, it was amazing to see all the selfies and photos that people were taking, and they felt a lot of pride that someone had turned their story into a virtual experience. But what I wasn't, and I kind of guessed about that, but I'll skip to this one. What I wasn't expecting is the deep emotional responses that people had, and with crying in a headset. That's something actually I never thought about as a potential problem, fogging up practically the glasses. I didn't expect that until I saw it happen over and over again. People being brought to tears. Well, the cadence of the experience, I intentionally created a tapestry of emotions, thinking about how you can connect to history emotionally by feeling a sense of pride, right? By feeling a sense of remorse, by feeling a sense of anger. And I try to weave those things in the experience using empathy, using the touch controllers, using a little bit of music in some cases to kind of guide them through that experience. And if you see here the images of the vignettes, are just kind of slideshows, pictures of the different scenes that you're dropped in through it. One of the early things, this is a very practical note about VR, is that the early edition, I had the voice of Mr. Taylor Rogers, who's a sanitation worker, communicating the story. People did not listen to Mr. Rogers because they were so stimulated by being in VR. So what I had to do was create in-between scenes in which you heard the author's voice, you heard him telling his story, you saw black and white images, and then from there, I drop you into this very immersive. And it's something for us to kind of think about when we try to create new norms for this type of medium. So as I said, this has been received very well from the public. It's received several different film awards, and from me as an academic, I didn't think about this as an approach for dissemination, if you will. And it was only a colleague that said, hey, think alternative places where you might showcase that project. So for me as someone who feels very comfortable in this setting, being around other academics, being around in a place to deliver, I was thrown into places where I was talking to producers and artists and musicians, and it was a growing thing for me. But it's interesting to see how a piece of scholarship like this could appeal to multiple domains. And last but not least, because I released it in the Oculus store, you're able to get real, authentic feedback about what people say about the piece. That ranges across the board. Number one is one of my favorite ones now. I was angered when I first read it, but I have now settled into it because there are people who are going to respond to this differently. So a liberal agenda to promote racism, to exacerbate the history of blacks in America. And then like right after that, you'll read a poignant experience that puts history into your hands and the fights for justice in your heart. I love the opportunity to give it straight to the public, to let them receive it and hear. Because I think both comments tell us something about America, and it tells us something about how history is perceived and received from different people. So I'll end it on there and pass it on.
So I'm very delighted to be here to talk to you about the virtual Martin Luther King project. And one of the things that's remarkable about this project is how it keeps building communities. So Dr. Ham was also instrumental to this project and to particularly putting us into a virtual reality platform in addition to the gaming platform that we had started with. We were able, in a remarkable thing, to be able to present the VMLK project at the Smithsonian last October during a very special festival there. We were there for 3 days, and thousands of people came through and experienced the project. For some of you who were able to do the viewfinder, you know, the magic glasses out there, a great majority of those thousands of people experienced the project that way and through a running loop of video and documentary and all kinds of things that we had up. But quite a few also experienced it through the Oculus Rift and through listening stations and gaming stations. This is, as you might be able to tell, a very multi-layered project, which started out, because I'm a scholar of communication and rhetoric and public address, all about sound and the way in which sound is immersive in ways that perhaps even vision, even with an Oculus Rift headset, are not. We have a certain kind of dimensionality to what we see, but sound is always all around us. So this project started with a recreation because the speech that is featured as part of this project, which was given in 1960 in Durham at the White Rock Baptist Church, there's no known recording, despite much searching. There's a transcript that's held in the Stanford papers, the King Archive there at Stanford University, which was used as the basis. So you need to know that when you hear moments of this, it's from a voice actor, Mr. Marvin Blanks. You're going to see our documentary of the project, and you'll be introduced to him and to what occurred. And this recreation and then the incredible sound recordings we made are at the basis of this. The sanctuary was torn down in 1968 to make way for the Durham Freeway, and we didn't even have a complete set of architectural plans. You'll hear a little bit more about that as well. So first of all, though, I want to take us just to talk a little bit further about how we conceptualize this project in relation to this restoration of humanity. That's part of what Kim Gallen, our colleague, has theorized so beautifully as technologies of recovery. So this gives you a little bit more information about the civil rights history people learned through this project. The speech was called a creative protest, but it's known as the Fill Up the Jail speech. It marked the first time that King publicly came out to say that the future of the movement, what you students of North Carolina are doing, is the future. And we're going to put the full weight of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference behind you. Up to that point, he had not thought that direct nonviolent social action was the best way because it was too dangerous. He had long argued with Reverend Moore, who was a classmate of his in Boston, about this. King believed that the traditional rhetorical arts of speaking, preaching, writing were the best way to change people's hearts and minds about race. Reverend Moore, who you'll again meet in our video in just a few, said no, even back when they were students together at Boston, it's got to be direct social action. People are not going to change unless we do the direct. And even though King came to prominence because of the Montgomery bus boycott, he still felt that that kind of action, putting people on the line out there, was still too dangerous, right? So this becomes the marker, the point where he says, yes, let's do it, and we'll fill up the jails of the South. We'll do it until we fill up the jails of the South. So despite all of this historical relevancy and importance and significance of the speech, again, there's no known recording. It's a little known speech in a certain way. I mean, if you know civil rights history and you know public address, then you know it. But otherwise, you probably have not heard or read it. So this gives a prominence to something that we would have otherwise kind of lost and wouldn't be a part of people's knowledge. The next thing is this transformative critique and understanding of race and digital technology. This is a really significant part of the project. We think that digital humanities is well positioned to illuminate civic life, but we think the rhetorical tradition is especially useful to bringing those to bear on everyday experiences of race and inequality. And this project invites civic and political engagement through all of these ways you can experience this speech and the ways in which it brings communities of people together and opens up history for people in a remarkable way. It also provides a really interesting way for us to test and critique and reconsider our assumptions about historical connections between these instances of public address and social transformation, particularly the affordances and constraints of material spatial contexts in which we experience public address. So one of the things we really ended up doing is to take a very materialist, experiential approach to public address. We know it can transform. We know that happens. But we have not really been able to explore that as deeply as this project lets us do. And then finally, how do we use digital tools to really do this work in remarkable ways? You've already seen one fabulous project. I Am a Man is really remarkable and an amazing gift to our communities. Here we're doing something that has sound as its center, that has public address as its center, that has community and transformation and creations of community at its center. And we do this in multiple ways. We have a walk-in version at NC State's Hunt Library, where you walk into and feel like you're in the old sanctuary and where you're with other people. And as you move around the room, it's like you're sitting in the front pew or the middle pew or the back pew. The sound changes as your position in the room changes. So it really puts you into that, but you're with other people and you're not augmented. You don't have a headset on. So it gives you a very social sense of being in that place. And we've talked a lot among our team, just what does that mean in terms of social visual reality or social immersion with the digital tools. I'm going to let you watch the project video for a minute and I'll come back with a few more comments. Pardon?
Victor Hugo once said that there is nothing in the world more powerful than an idea whose time has come.
I had a hunch that we could do something that really foregrounded sound and an experience of sound as a way to be distinct and also memorable to people. So I kind of had this team out there looking while I was working on a book chapter related to the 1957 Royal Ice Cream Sit-In Parlor movement. And lo and behold, the speech that they came up with, which was the speech that Dr. King gave at the White Rock Baptist Church in February of 1960, just about a week and a half, 2 weeks after the start of the Greensboro sit-in, was that speech. And it really did bring everything together. Its location had been torn down to make way for the Durham Freeway, and there was no known recording. We had transcripts from the speech, but no known recording of the speech. So it kind of was the perfect speech that came at the perfect time.
Let us not fear going to jail. If the official threatens to arrest us for standing up for our rights, we must answer by saying that we are willing and prepared to fill up the jails of the South.
So the very first phase was how to sort of reenact that at the current White Rock Baptist Church, even though that's not the original church. Then the second phase was to produce the audio recordings of the actual speech and making it available online for the public. And then the third phase, which we're currently in, is creating a 3D model as if you were actually on the inside of the sanctuary during the day that King gave the Fill Up the Jail speech in Durham.
Yeah, creating the model is really a challenge now because the existing church is no longer there, so we can't go out and just measure it and take photographs. So we're relying on historical documents, photographs, a few plans. We don't have a full set of architectural plans, so that's created a challenge for us. But we do have plans from the event where they installed an organ in the church, so we have a few really critical dimensions where we can start to pull from and build our digital model from those. But the photographs have been really helpful because that helps us to understand, the window patterns, the textures on the wall, how many seats were in the auditorium, and things like that.
We're not trying to make an exact copy. What we're trying to do is produce something that gives us a sense of what that was like, and to help us understand what it was that transformed people that night and what can transform people today.
And what this project highlights is that in North Carolina, there was also very civic-minded innovations here as well. So to do a sort of project like Virtual MLK and bringing together the production, pedagogical focus, but also the community engagement really highlights the sorts of things that NC State does well. So we drew from expertise in audio visual, also in rhetoric, in communication, but we also drew from people who were skilled in media studies, helping us to think about the project, and also in film.
I think joining any multidisciplinary team, the first step is always, getting around the table and understanding what each of you does and what you can bring to the project. And for us, Keon Pettiway, who's working on the project for a long time, has really been our chief researcher, if you will. He's gathered quite an array of images from church members from the past, from historical documents and archives that are in Durham. And so we've been using those.
There's a way in which people coming together to bring their creativity to bear on a research project or a social problem or a political problem or whatever it might be, really can do interesting and exciting things.
The experience has been one of mainly about seeing the project grow, and in particular how the project has been engaged with the community. So as researchers and as developers and designers and scholars of the project, we have particular intentions, but once you put products out in the world, you never know what's going to happen.
The other thing for me is I grew up in Greensboro, and so I grew up always knowing about the sit-ins at Woolworth. So I didn't know the story about this speech at White Rock, the Philip the Jail speech, that occurred just a few days after those events in Greensboro. So for me, it's another step in a historical story where I knew parts, and now I feel like I know more.
One of the misnomers of what some people thought about the project, right? That the project was mostly about Martin Luther King. It's another project about his life. But what the project exposes is that there were everyday people in Durham, North Carolina, students, people who were involved in religious organizations who made a great impact on our society and its civic innovation. So what I would hope people would take away from the project is that a creative protest can be staged by anyone. You don't have to be a king to do so.
And remember that both history and destiny is on your side. All the stars in their course are supporting you. Go out with the attitude that God is with us and we have a cosmic companionship. And one day, historians in this era might be able to say, there are the great people of black people who injected a new meaning into civilization.
So one of the key things that is really important about, oops, looks like I'm now on a fast forward. And let me go back. Hold on just a sec. One of the things that's important to know and that the project, people learn about through their experiences with the project, is that the reason that King gave this very important speech in 1960, just 2 weeks after the start of the Greensboro sit-ins, the reason he gave it at a church in Durham, not a church in Greensboro, was because Reverend Douglas Moore invited him. And that's because Reverend Douglas Moore had been doing direct social action in Durham for multiple years, including that 1957 Royal Ice Cream Parlor sit-in. And what he said to King, because he ran over to Greensboro as soon as he heard about the students starting the sit-ins, he and Floyd McKissick Sr. ran over to Greensboro to help those students and to support them in any way that they could. And he reached out to King and said, King, give it in Durham. In Durham, we're ready. We're ready to hear this. Because this was King's time when he was going to come out and say, this is the movement. This is where we're going. So it's a remarkable thing to have these pieces of history come together and see how these all interrelate. And so one of the things that the project, definitely our goal is to expand this knowledge of civil rights history. We heard David Hill, one of our project contributors, say, I lived in Greensboro. I knew part of the history, now I know more. We also want to kind of expand people's appreciation for the scope of civic and political engagement, as you heard my colleague, Dr. Pettiway, say in the video. It wasn't just King. There are all these people who had such a huge role. But yeah, this is a speech that helps bring it all together, so let's look at it. And then, of course, we want to expand people's understanding of the transformative and affective aspects of public speech. Ironically, this is a speech where he says speaking isn't enough, and yet we know speaking does matter. So it's a really interesting project because of that contrasting set of claims. We think that when we articulate this both as a technology of recovery and a way of theorizing public address as experience, as an immersive experience, it becomes really important. And so we argue that there are sort of three rhetorical functions. There's a locative function of this experience where people are located, not just in terms of time or in terms of where this took place in North Carolina, but also as they go through the spirit, the sound locates you in relationship to King, in relationship to other people who are there with you, in relationship to the physical environment of a sanctuary like White Rock Baptist Church, and that locative function matters. It helps us understand all kinds of things about churches and about communities and about how they work. So that locative function is really important. And we show you some images. The top image is where people do the walk-in experience, where all around them are the images of the sanctuary that night, and they can hear the sound as if they were in the original sanctuary. And they can move. They can sit up front, they can move to the middle, they can move to the back. And people have preferences. It's remarkable to see how much that matters to them for where they can position themselves. They listen to the whole speech. Interestingly enough, this one is probably the place where people listen to the whole speech. It's harder to do in the Oculus Rift or in the VR and the gaming. You know, our attention gets moved a little bit more, but here they do, and they listen to the full speech, and it's a powerful speech. We have over 1,000 public speaking students a year who go through this as part of their training to do advocacy speeches, and it's a really impactful experience for them. We also say it's got a generative function. So this project really generates things. People feel called or hailed as an audience member in their own body and in their own racial identity and experience to respond in some ways. And I'll show you the responses in a little bit. But they also really get a sense of all these people who were involved in it. And they get a sense of what urban renewal and destruction meant on the heels of civil rights. The gains of civil rights is when we had so many African-American, very strong African-American communities really were devastated by highways being put through the middle of them, freeways, expressway on-ramps. And so this becomes a large part of what people know and what they start to respond to. Why did we do this? How could we do this? Here you see we give people opportunities to write on whiteboards, to write in response to prompts, to fill out iPad surveys, all kinds of things. Some of these pictures were from the Smithsonian when people came through and they wanted to respond to what they were seeing in the project. And obviously for a lot of people this is a very emotionally compelling as well as kind of historically compelling experience for them. So providing ways to respond, and we collect all those responses and organize them and utilize them as we continue to move the project forward. And then finally, this comparative function, what people really seem to articulate in addition to the generative, like what does this mean for me and what am I going to do, they very much get this comparative. They get that this is both history and not history, right? They're in this historical moment, but they also get that they're not in the historical moment. They're in their own bodies. We did the recreation just before the start of the Moral Monday protests in Raleigh, and we had a huge congregation who came, about 250 to 300 people, and lots of folks, 10 to 15 who'd been there the night of the original speech, and one of King's very dear friends came. So we had lots of conversation about what this meant and what this was like, and we continue to have this when we do exhibitions both at NC State and elsewhere. Here you can see some of the ways that people were engaging with this at the Smithsonian. You see the magic classes, which some of you got to do. You see some listening stations with students at computers. You see a little girl doing the gaming simulation. It was a really remarkable thing to watch people move through this and to engage with them as they did. These are some of the 6 ways that we can experience the VMLK. We think about it in all of these 6 different ways. Our next development of our website will feature some taste of all 6 of these. Right now, you can get some taste of the sound ones on there, and that's a really important piece. We also have pedagogical materials, documentary videos, both ours and the Counter History video, which is an awesome video about the 1957 Royal Ice Cream Parlor sit-in. But we are going to put the rest of these, at least a taste of each of the rest of these, up on the website. Some of the exhibitions and installations, we've done multiple, some at NC State, some at the Smithsonian, some at other universities. We're going to be doing a big special presentation at Rochester Institute of Technology this coming February, which is going to be remarkable. Here you see some images of some of our renderings early on of the gaming and VR platform. And finally, a picture of the website and the listening experiences people can utilize, and then some of the responses, what people say in response. These are taken from the Experience in King at NC State exhibition, which occurred in 2016 and was a remarkable day. We had over 300 people come through and do all aspects of the project throughout the library. Just a few more of these reflections. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Pettiway for just a few minutes to remind us about our questions and to open it up, and I'll also help with sharing Kim Gallen's responses.
So in response to Kim Gallen's question about technology recovery, you see that we have addressed several of those questions, and the project has some utility for addressing some others that we have not addressed here. But at the juncture, right, to consider DH, Digital Humanities and Black Studies, what does it mean to also consider this at the juncture of rhetorical studies and design studies in relation to Black digital humanities? Again, a few questions that we could consider. How does this use of recreating and creating anew give us something about an experience of Black history or public address, and how does it shape or change our knowledge? To what extent do augmented or online gaming and VR simulations capture the uniqueness and immediacy and interactivity of Black history and public address? And you've seen those kind of played out in both projects today in a number of ways. What can we learn about the role of practices of commemoration and or public address and social and civic transformation? So as I stated earlier, there certainly have been commemorations and memorials that have used digital technologies such as VR, right? Certainly well before the advent of VR, but what does it mean to do that in relation to commemorative spaces? And what do we know, right? What can we learn about from these projects? What does it mean to do Black digital humanities from the perspective of humanities and design scholarship in relation to digital technologies, purpose to build communities? And then what does it tell us about how do you actually lead digital humanity projects by way of 2 of these kind of examples? And we do have a few of Kim Gallen's responses to both.
So I'm just going to read what Kim sent to us as her response, and Keon's really done a beautiful job of setting up some of this in bullet points, so he'll move through those. She says, the set of questions that we pose here framing the presentation are excellent. I particularly appreciate how attention is given to thinking about how to recreate or create an experience of Black history. However, I would urge you to think about the role of trauma in recovering Black historical experience. Because the African American experience is defined by extraordinary accomplishment and struggle, how might online gaming and VR simulations expose people to some of the tensions and pain of a particular historical experience? This is particularly important to ask since you are focusing on single experiences or events. What methods or tools do you have to help learners contextualize the experience in the very moment they are experiencing it? It also seems to me that there are overlapping processes of recovery occurring in multiple spaces at once. There's the recovery of the literal experience of the sanitation strike, but there's also the recovery of the collective American memory of this moment. This is all occurring in the physical space that houses the VR technology. What are the implications of this experience for the cognitive factors involved in learning? What about the social factors? As an instructional designer of Black Learning Design herself, Kim is, and Black DH, I really like the attempt to use Bloom's taxonomy to think about how learning occurs within the I Am a Man project. Nonetheless, I wonder if Bloom's taxonomy is the best model to classify the acquisition of knowledge about the Black experience. Or at the least, perhaps it's wise to think about how VR technology exposes different learners' engagement with knowledge about the Black experience. For example, the use of the hand presence is going to show up very differently in white and Black learners, as Derek mentioned. Many African Americans already experience the physical embodiment of racism. What does it mean for them to interact with VR in this context? Again, I'm thinking here of the recovery of trauma. In terms of thinking about civic transformation and public address, this is great. In terms of a learning strategy, I wonder if it would be helpful for learners to marry personal accounts of attending King's or other speeches with the VR experience. And like I mentioned, we found that very powerful in our exhibitions. If you haven't already, I would highly recommend to you all that you touch base with Brian Carter at the University of Phoenix. He is the founder of Virtual Harlem, and she gives the information about how to connect to that. You're doing such important and groundbreaking work. Thank you for allowing me to contribute my thoughts to your projects. And we're very thankful to her.
Well, with that, we will conclude our presentations. Thank you for your time. Oh, yes. Let me put the contact information here on this slide. Thank you, Derek.
And do, if you have questions about how this has all worked and how we've brought it together, and especially if you're thinking about doing a project like this yourself or you're engaged in a project, we are very happy to address those questions as well. And of course, if you want to talk to Derek about his next appearances, no, he's just been on the road a lot, or whatever you'd like to ask, we're happy to entertain.
Great, so we've got about 20 minutes, right? The session ends at 3:45. So questions that you have, I ask that you speak up. This is being live streamed, so big booming voices so we can get you on the mic.
I've been following this for a while, and so I'm glad to be able to see the most recent versions of it and hear you all talk about it at this point. It's groundbreaking, I think, and is really going to be the template for things like this moving forward. At the same time, I have this anxiety about the rhetoric of immersion that is often attached with virtual reality. And so, you're in situations, in many cases it seems, exhibit spaces that are a little more controlled. You're there, you're able to do pre and post as you were saying. And I recently have experienced the Carne y Arena exhibit by Alexandra Inarritu, which is here. I mean, you're here-ish, it's close, which is the experience of crossing the border, right? It's a VR experience crossing the border. And they have an amazing sort of pre and post setup. So I'm very sensitized to how powerful and how important that is to contextualize. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little more about the pre and the post, what you do, and then what do you do, or how might we think about when this is just on the Oculus App Store and you don't have that same kind of opportunities to do the pre and post, because I think that the reception and the experience of this in a more an exhibit space versus just like in my living room with a bowl of Cheetos next to me is very different. And so I'm very curious to hear about your thoughts on that.
I mean, that's I think the challenging thing with VR and its nature that you have to relinquish control. You can't control what people look at over there, and putting it in the store definitely is another level of relinquishing control. And that, as you said, I have no idea what people could be doing as they replay those. If you want to kind of position someone so that they come to the experience with some reverence, you can't control that in their home environment as much as you can when you do an installation or something like that. I try to do my best that it's minimal in explanation of what you go through. But at the end of the day, when I really talked about the pre, during, and post was about the plans that are for the actual Civil Rights Museum. And in the discussions with the museum, time and time again, we had conversations of what we saw successfully at the VMLK. Places for reflection, giving someone an outlet to write on a wall, to write a note, to respond. Oftentimes, because I don't have a whiteboard under it, I became the emotional dump afterwards. And people coming out, and either I've had the crying, the hug, I've also had the defense. Yeah, I remember growing up in my town, blacks weren't treated well, and I'm not saying that was good. I'm not saying it was bad, just the way it was. That actually happened to me. And I was like, wow. And you just shake your head, you just listen to them, because I know they're dealing with something, and I'm just happy that this awoke, something in them to let them be uncomfortable to have to say something like that. But that just, for me, stresses the importance of they need to talk to someone. They need to have an outlet. And I love what VMLK has done. I think the ultimate goal in someone at the Civil Rights Museum would be to have that corridor, that little space, whether you're writing on a whiteboard or something, because it's emotional, walking people through those things. And in a lot of ways, this work does follow some of the traditions that we see already being done. In Greensboro, they have the headset you can put on, put your hands on the counter, and that's rough. That's a lot to deal with. So we can learn from those. I personally just don't think it needs to happen all in VR. I think it's important for you to come out and then have that moment, and not in VR just go to another virtual space to reflect. I'm like, I want to bring you out. You need to talk to another human being. You need to take a deep breath. You need to let that process.
And just for all kinds of ways to just talk a little bit about, this is why we talk about VMLK as having so many layers, and that we try to provide as many layers as possible whenever we present to contextualize it. And there is a way in which this project, part of it is because of the way in which the King family is very much protective of the speeches and writings of King. So making sure this is always an educational venture, that there's no tie to any store or any other kind of technology producer in a way that maybe we could do, but we just won't with this project because of those issues. And so always articulating it in educational settings like libraries, like universities, like museums, it does give us more control. The big thing we have to think about is, as we put some of our VR content up, or our gaming content up online, how do we protect it from being grabbed for other uses, right? And that's something that we're talking about and thinking about, and our library is very well equipped to help us think that through. So, like you said, we have it very controlled in a very set of things so that it becomes very layered, and that the pre and post and how they respond, is structured in those ways. At the same time, I don't think people feel that. They feel it as very invitational, and they feel it as exploratory, because they can enter it in all these ways and respond in different ways, if that makes sense. So, I don't know, Keon, can I add anything?
I think it helps us to do two things. First, it helps us to take pause and think about what does it mean to learn in these spaces. Second, and to this point, a sub-point with that is that it makes us move beyond what do we mean as educational spaces. Here, when we figure blackness, we figure that while the educational institution is one place where people learn, we also have to think about these enclaves where people have learned, these more private spaces where people have learned. And the fact that some people have to have these experiences for a number of reasons. Maybe they want to say certain things, but have to do it in a certain enclave or another certain space, right? So I think it makes us think about what does it mean to actually learn with VR, and does that even disrupt our ontological means of what it means to be human, but also what it means to be human and learn in this kind of way, right? So in this case, we could take I think to the second point is working with VR in these projects also help us expand our conceptual and our theoretical lens across disciplines, right? So let's take it even with rhetoric, for instance. We know that in our discipline, we have talked about the constitutive moment where people are held, right? But there's been a number of scholars such as Jasinski and others who said, but there's also been reconstitutive moments. There's also been pre-constitutive moments. So to think of VR as that one space, theoretically and conceptually, it makes us go back to rhetoric to say, well, what about those pre-constitutive and those reconstitutive moments, right? Where people are held over and over again, or even prior to the VR experience. For design, if we take it in terms of design, a conceptual language that helps us there is thinking about the design journey. Not the moment, not the one event. There's a number of work that's happening in terms of journey mapping. Thinking about the spaces wherein people come into contact with information that moves beyond the actual site where we think people come into contact with information, right? And then when we think about Black studies, one thing that keeps coming to mind a lot is the scratch, right? When we think about music, you might hear the beat and but when the scratch comes, it's a time for you to pay attention. So in this case, it's not so much that it's rhetoric in your experience in terms of that VR experience is the one and only, but it might be the scratch. This might be the moment to kind of take stock and take pause to listen. It's a disruption, right? And it's kind of not in a monotone, but in between the beat and in between the lyrics and the sound, you have this pause. Nice. Even if it's just for one moment, right?
And then I saw another question.
I had a question. I've used VR a few times. I find the platform with a stunning potential, but I can't figure out what to do with my hands when I'm in the environment. I don't know what to do with it. So the images immerse me. I can imagine sound as a texture, as an immersive texture, but I haven't found as a user how to do something with my fingers in that virtual space that mimics what the representations of me is doing in that virtual space. How did you handle the controllers in your design to sort of make the experience more immersive?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's trade-off, and I'll explain what I mean by this. The first scene in I Am a Man, you're standing in the alley and a garbage truck is coming back towards you. And a lot of people, it's funny, if you've never done VR, they're like, is the truck gonna roll over me? What's going on? They're kind of uncomfortable. But then as it comes and stops, there's 2 trash cans there. And you can pick up the trash cans and start putting trash. And if it falls on the ground, people intuitively reach down to the ground. They feel it back a little bit. And they pick up trash and they try to get as much trash as they can. Several people have come out there and said, man, I like how that was. I like how you made me, it was kind of sloppy. And I had to get down with my hands and pick things up. And then they looked at their hands. Obviously, it's like, if you're not black, you're like, oh my goodness, my hands are black. And that just, it blows your mind away. So I watch people, what they're doing, to see how much they're in there. But what's interesting is, towards the end, historically what happened is after when there were riots there was curfew all around. And I used that for my advantage to do an interesting scene. When you as a sanitation worker, you're out there, there's fire, some of the people are around, they walk away, and the police officer comes. Now, if you're black, police officer comes and the police officer comes up and says, put your hands in the air. Now, I've seen time after time, we're hands in the air. Now, interesting to see how I've seen people who aren't black. They're just kind of like, huh? Like what? And I'm like, there's something it hasn't captured yet because it hasn't triggered the initial response of what's about to happen. And I talked to people who've come out there, and most people of color, especially young black men, have said, I didn't know what you did as a programmer. Like, I didn't know I just know in the real world what happens, so I complied as quickly as I could. And time after time, I've seen people like, put your hands in the air, like what? Like, I'm like, whoa, that's interesting for me. My heart races when I'm on the highway and a trooper pulls up, driving the speed limit. So I use that as an example. But then when I look at the VMLK, Here's the trade-off that I'm slightly concerned about. I've seen people clap with the VR headset. When they get moved, the audience like, yes, they start to rock in, and they do this. Can't clap with a controller. And that frustrates me because as much as they work well, and we might embody hands in there, for something like being in an audience with King, you want to respond as naturally as everyone else. So I'm kind of like, oh, that's a potentially a bad trade-off, because I want for the individual to be moved when you hear the audience clap, to clap their hand. So that's, like we said, we're figuring out these things right now, and you have to do them to kind of learn. That's we're at a crossroad right now. So sure, you could be in the church and pick up potentially a pamphlet and grab it and look and see it, but what's the most important thing? So the most important thing is for you to be an audience member. Maybe the hand controllers aren't what you want, and you want to free that person to make a noise themselves. And this is part of our learning experience.
Oh, yes, I just wanted to make sure no one else wanted to jump in.
No, you go ahead.
Relative to that too, thinking about how much attention there is, or how much sort of consideration there is of like African American rhetorical practices, especially given the church space, given the sort of like the ways that the body's located in that space, participate, call and response, the sort of the sort of screens that exist between read or an audience get blurred, mean different things, the way rhetorical practice accounts for signification, so on and so forth, and how much that consideration is taken into the actual creation of the virtual space.
Yeah, this was huge for us. I mean, nobody here has asked this question, but we often get asked about the call and response. Like, where did that come from? And that came from the 250 people who were at the recreation. And we didn't prompt them. I mean, we didn't hold up signs or anything. I mean, they were responding. We did have a very fine partner in Deacon Jenkins, who's a deacon at the church currently, who stood up and welcomed people. I don't know if you could tell from the little clip of, in our video where you're seeing Marvin Blanks performing, you're seeing the choir behind. I mean, this was a really, a Sunday afternoon, everybody in the community coming together.
They sang first, right?
They sang first, they sang last, they were there, the congregation was there, the Durham Ministerial Alliance was there. I mean, it was a big event for all of us. And he just stood up and explained that in our church, here's what we do when we are met with what we're going to meet with, which is Dr. King's words being done by Mr. Marvin Blanks. Here's what we would do. We would respond. If there's something that we want to affirm, we might say this or we might do that. Anyways, he just gave a really rousing and beautiful about 3 minutes, and that was it. And that was what that community of people gave us then, or gave Mr. Blanks as he performed this speech in that space. So it really was organic in a sense, and it really was powerful. And for instance, I talked about students in COM 110 public speaking going through this. You know, we'll have students who in the debrief will say things like, well, you know, maybe if I had an audience who was that responsive, I would be a better speaker too. Or, you know, they talk about that feeling, or you'll have people who come out and talk about sitting there with these people around me, or having people around me, and how much that matters to their experience of the speech, and how different that is in terms of reading the speech text or encountering it in some other way. So those features were really important, and it gets back to what Derek was saying about the hands. We have been talking a lot about whether we introduce hands or not in our project, and one of the things that is, we want people to listen to the speech. We don't want them to do a lot of other things.
And they fidget. When you get into VR the first time.
They do a lot of other things, right? Yeah. And young kids in particular, when they go into VR, they're so used to it being a task or set of challenges or problems or games, so that when they want to explore the space, they're trying to see, what can I throw? How far out can I go? How far in can I go? You know, they're doing all these other things in the space. So you're really struck with this challenge of what has VR been used for up to this point, and what's its potential to do other things, and what are those potential other things, and how do we articulate them in meaningful ways. So
2 weeks ago, I saw a piece of technology that I think scholars should pay attention to, and it's developed by Bose, who makes, of course, speakers, but they make what's called AR glasses. And so all it feeds is an audio through the actual glass here, but it tracks spatially. So Dr. Gallagher was talking about this idea of focusing your attention on one sensory input. Potentially that could be a really powerful thing. And when I tried it, you know, I was just like, okay, well, they just put speakers in the glass, and he pulled the demo. He's like, okay, now move over there. And I started walking across the room in this invisible thing that was making a noise. And when I went like this, I heard it there, and I went like this, I heard it there. And so they are developing, they're called AR glasses by Bose, that's saying our approach to augmented reality is about sound and spatial sound, seating in environments. And something like this, they're not released yet, so they're only doing a couple different tech demos at different places, but something I think, you know, we should respond to the technology. We should see what the affordances are, what's our end goal, and I think across the board, we've just been trying to be flexible, responding to as things came out. When the VMLK project, when I first joined it and started talking about VR, touch controllers didn't exist for Oculus on that day one. So it's like we're adapting, we're being, you know, responsive. You know.
One way I have this is post many of the experiences that we've provided at publicly. One way that I've started to think about call and response is it's more time bending, if you will, and I'm thinking more about what people talk about in terms of griotic performance, right? The griot is a time bender, both from past, present, and future. And it's in many ways I see the call and response as this kind of, we can think about it in terms of public address more as time bending. It's not situated in the historical moment of 1960, but it's also situated in 2015 and 16 when it was given. It's also situated in the now. So to think about public address and sound and call and response, we have to think about it not, did they respond that way when King gave the speech, right? Or is this similar to, so I would think that it helps us sort of shift our concern to not simply a historical situation as in then, but we're time bending. Call and response is not there or here, but it's in different spaces. All about how we think about what can call and response do, right? I think we've also done a kind of call and response by way of not necessarily to only one aspect of the project, but we actually ask people to provide their comments on boards, or we ask them to provide their feedback via online. That in itself gives people a way to talk back to the entire experience, right? And recognizing that collectivity and that call and response, even through a textual form, is important.
All right, we've got about 5 more minutes. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Are you how germane is Bloom's, with the conception of Bloom's taxonomy that you use to the project? Because I'm sure you're aware there's other sort of conceptions of the taxonomy that like flip it to an agentive frame, and I'm wondering if you thought about that.
This honestly was a piece of reflection for me thinking about the project. I did not approach this project to say, this is a learning tool, this is what has to happen. I've just, now that it's been used by different people in classroom settings and plan to be in the museum, I'm taking a step back on my own work and being reflective and say, okay, what's going on here? So when I do the next one, I can be more intent on the planning. So that's just one potential lens I'm looking at the project for as I go forward. But yes, absolutely, I'll be considering lots of different things as I get to the root. And one of my PhD students at NC State, his PhD is about learning in VR and really trying to crack down to say, what does that even mean? How do people learn in a virtual environment? And not training. That's the interesting thing. People say that, you always say, oh, training. Like, military's been using VR for training in VR for a long time. So if we get to that term learning, that's a completely different thing here.
And it is an interesting thing. I don't know if I've talked to you about this, Derek, but when we were first trying to figure out how we wanted to do some assessment and evaluation of our project, particularly in relation to COM 110 and learning outcomes, we did a scan of communication education and other kind of educational literature to look at what was out there on immersive learning. And there's not a lot, but there's a couple of interesting kind of conceptualizations and articulations of what that might look like. But that's one of the things we're hoping to contribute to as we look at all this data and feedback that we're getting from the students going through this, is a way of perhaps articulating a framework or a set of ideas along those lines, because there's not a lot of good stuff out there right now, I don't think.
I think if we think about, to Derek's point, I remember at the National Humanities Center, this was a few years ago, we had a session there that was about digital humanities and how to do this kind of work. And one thing that came up was that a number of colleagues voiced a concern about us not publishing our reflections in journals. Right, then when we come to talk about, for instance, Bloom's taxonomy, the notion is that we had already forethought this is what we use as our lens. But when we talk about it in our work, if we're looking at it in journals or conceptualizations, we talk less about how we came to that point as a kind of reflection, right? So I think one way to do that is by thinking about what many scholars have done in a number of disciplines about the reflective practitioner, reflection in action and reflection on action. Right, I think that might shift our lens in digital humanities a bit to not think about we have already forethought how we want to develop the project. And for VMLK, this has been true in terms of the ways in which we prototype. Right, that prototyping kind of happens both in reflection in action, but on action. So when people see our exhibitions, what they don't know is all that reflection and work that went into building up to that point. It's, oh, you developed that and kind of, no, this was a lot of reflection and going back and forth and prototyping. Right. But we don't talk about it that much and theorize and conceptualize it.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true, but it is central, to what we do.
All right, well, please join me in thanking our panel.